This story begins on a quiet summer night in Kansas City. The streets looked empty as Chris was driving, his girlfriend sitting beside him, while their two friends were in the back seat. It was prom night, and they were all enjoying the moment. Chris wanted to make it feel more special. He turned off the car's headlights and opened the roof so they could see the fireflies more clearly and enjoy the night view freely. But that idea changed the mood. His friends started feeling uncomfortable and thought it was too dangerous. One of them asked Chris to turn the lights back on. His girlfriend also began to panic and begged him to do the same. Chris finally agreed, but it was already too late. In an instant, their car crashed into a broken-down harvester on the road. 4 years passed since that incident, and life never went back to how it was. The world felt darker, and the consequences of that night kept haunting them. Chris and his girlfriend survived, but the two friends in the back seat didn't. The guilt stayed with him, like a weight he could never let go of. The accident also left serious effects on Chris's condition. He developed emotional issues and short-term memory problems. His brain couldn't store new information, so he relied completely on a notebook to live his life. Every morning, he had to read it to remember who he was and what he needed to do. This routine kept repeating and never got any easier. Chris attended classes at the Life Skills Center to learn basic things, but even that felt difficult for him. After class, he realized his car was locked with the keys inside. This kind of thing happened often, so he always kept a spare key in his shoe. Still carrying his guilt, Chris took some time to visit Kelly, his ex-girlfriend. She lost her leg in the accident and now lives with a prosthetic leg. She had plenty of reasons to hate him, and Chris couldn't deny that. After that, Chris checked his schedule and remembered he had an appointment with Janet. The meeting started awkwardly when he hugged her for too long, making her uncomfortable. Chris asked about her life, but the way he spoke started to feel off. He made an inappropriate comment, and Janet immediately stopped him firmly. She believed his behavior was influenced by his brain injury, which made it hard for him to control himself. Even so, Chris kept trying to flirt, until Janet reminded him that she was there for work. When she asked what he actually wanted, Chris went quiet for a moment, then in a heavy tone said he just wanted to be his old self again. Chris went home, where his roommate, Lewis, had left a voicemail with a dinner recipe. Lewis was blind, but still independent. Chris tried to cook, but couldn't find the can opener. Frustration quickly built up, and he started throwing things in the kitchen. He then called Lewis, who came over right after finishing what he was doing. Chris apologized for the mess, while Lewis calmly started cooking for them. While cooking, Lewis asked about Chris's school. Chris said he was assigned to write an essay about his daily routine, but he didn't know what to write other than, "I wake up." Lewis suggested that he treat it like a story. Chris still struggled, so Lewis asked him to try telling a children's fairy tale starting from the ending. Strangely, Chris was able to do it smoothly. From that, Lewis concluded that Chris hadn't actually lost his ability to think, only the order of things was messed up. That night, Chris went to work at a bank as a janitor. He actually wanted to become a full-time employee, but his boss, Mr. Tuttle, rejected him politely but clearly. It was as if the decision was final, and Chris was considered incapable of anything more. While working, Chris played around with his mop, as if his body still remembered his old life. The movement felt automatic, like a trace of someone he used to know, but now felt distant. A flashback shows how different Chris's life used to be. He was once a talented hockey player, the kind of athlete everyone expected to have a big future. But all of that was gone after the accident, as if his life had been cut off, leaving only a half-finished version of himself. One night, while Chris was working, a car was parked across the street from the bank. Inside was Gary, quietly watching him. Gary recognized Chris as an old friend, but instead of feeling sympathy, he looked at him with a mix of pity and judgment. Even so, Gary still told his friends to continue with their plan. After work, Chris went to a bar. He tried to talk to a woman next to him, but his approach was stiff and awkward. The conversation didn't go well. Then Gary showed up and immediately took over the situation. Effortlessly, he made the woman smile with just a few light remarks. Chris noticed that and started taking notes, trying to copy Gary's style. But Gary stopped him and introduced himself as a friend of Chris's sister.
Anyway,
When the bartender tried to take advantage of Chris by shortchanging him, Gary stepped in and forced the bartender to give it back. Gary seemed like a confident and relaxed guy, everything Chris used to be. Even when Chris used his inhaler in the middle of the conversation, Gary still looked completely in control. They started talking about the accident, and Chris told him everything. Gary tried to encourage him by saying that when life takes something away, it usually gives something else in return. The words were simple, but enough to make Chris feel a little lighter. The next morning, Chris took Louis to his family's large house. Everyone there seemed successful and confident, except Chris. His parents spoke in a tone that sounded caring, but underneath it, there was clear judgment. They asked about his condition and his job in a way that made him feel small. There was an uncomfortable feeling seeing how the family's concern could feel like pressure, as if every word they said implied that Chris didn't meet their expectations. Louis accidentally mentioned their plan to open a restaurant, but the family immediately treated it like a joke. They didn't believe Chris was capable of taking on an important role there. Hearing that, Chris lost his patience. He went to his old room, but all he found were memories he didn't want to remember anymore. The only person who felt sincere to him was his sister, Nina. But Nina had to leave because of her child, and before she left, she said their father wanted to talk to Chris. His father invited him to play chess. Chris lost, and it became a reminder that he wasn't the same as before, even in something simple. On the way home, Louis spoke carefully. He asked Chris not to get mad about something he wanted to say. Chris reassured him, and Louis finally spoke honestly. Even though it wasn't explained in detail, Chris understood what he meant, and he chose to stay quiet because he knew it was true. At work, his friend Ted, a police officer, came by with dessert. He talked about his pregnant wife and how it made their home feel uncomfortable. Ted casually said that Chris was lucky he didn't have to deal with something like that, not realizing his words touched something sensitive. Chris chose not to respond. Ted left, while reminding him to lock the back door. Chris just joked that he often forgot even simpler things, like closing his car door. The next night, Chris went back to the bar. This time, he tried to copy the way Gary talked, repeating sentences he had heard before. But it ended up sounding strange and unnatural, making him look even more awkward. A woman named Louvely approached him and bought him a drink, saying it was from Gary. She said she used to be a dancer and now worked as a receptionist at the Chamber of Commerce. When she asked about Chris's job, he hesitated to answer. Chris even had trouble remembering Louvely's name, so he wrote it down in his notebook so he wouldn't forget. Not long after, Gary arrived with his girlfriend. They invited Chris and Louvely to their place. But when they got there, Gary and his girlfriend went straight into a room, leaving Chris and Louvely alone in the living room. Louvely started talking about how she used to watch Chris play hockey and had secretly liked him. She remembered him as someone great in the past. Chris responded by talking about those times again, but once more he lost control and said something too blunt. Chris felt embarrassed, but Louvely actually took it as a compliment. Their connection grew closer that night. After that, Gary drove Chris home. He asked how Chris's father would react if he saw where he lived now. Chris said his father had never even been there. Before leaving, Gary invited Chris to come to their Thanksgiving gathering. When he got home, Chris couldn't hide his condition from Louis. Louis immediately smelled alcohol and perfume, then realized what had happened. Instead of judging him, Louis was happy to see his friend enjoy the night. Chris told him everything about Louvely, but Louis felt something was off, even from her name. Chris explained that it was just a stage name because she used to be a dancer. As Chris explained how they met, Louis noticed something. He had never heard the name Gary before. Even though he still congratulated Chris, deep down, he felt like something wasn't right about all of this, even if he couldn't explain what it was. A few days later, Chris went to meet Gary and Louvely at a farmhouse. The place looked quite remote, and when Chris asked who owned it, they gave unclear answers. From the start, the atmosphere already felt a bit off. Gary then introduced Chris to his other friends. The conversation flowed casually. Everything felt like a normal gathering. But the mood changed when an old man with a walker suddenly appeared and started asking about their presents. Gary immediately told his uncle, Bone, to handle the situation. They said the house belonged to an acquaintance, but even Chris could tell something didn't add up. As the night went on, Chris woke up and heard Gary's girlfriend talking to her child on the phone, saying that she was at work. Curiosity led Chris down to the basement, and that's where everything started to unravel. On the walls were photos of banks, building layouts, schedules, security details, even a photo of himself. Gary then explained that they were planning to rob a small bank, which was expected to hold a lot of money because of the harvest season. Chris immediately questioned it. To him, it felt like they were stealing from farmers, but Gary easily twisted the explanation, saying the money actually belonged to big companies that profited off the farmers. The way Gary spoke made everything sound justified, as if they weren't doing anything wrong. Chris saw his own photo among all the plans and began to realize that he had been made part of their plan for a long time. Gary tried to explain it in a casual tone, as if it was something normal. Gary then started talking at length about how the world worked, about money and power, and how people like Chris's father would never truly help without conditions. Chris still believed his father would help if asked, so Gary told him to try asking for $10,000. Chris didn't answer right away. He looked confused, not knowing what to say. As he was about to leave, Louvely stopped him. They spent the night together, and the next morning when Chris left, Gary and Louvely quietly watched him from the window. It was clear that Chris had become part of their plan, whether he fully realized it or not. Meanwhile, Chris and Louis tried another step in their lives. They met with a financial advisor to discuss their plan to open a restaurant. They explained their concept and calculations, but the response wasn't what they expected. The advisor thought their plan was too weak, from unrealistic cost estimates to a menu concept that didn't make sense. Louis still tried to see the positive side, but Chris started losing confidence. On the other hand, Chris still secretly watched Kelly from a distance, without daring to actually talk to her. The following days felt heavier. Chris became more easily angered. But one day, a jacket arrived for him, along with a note from Louvely, saying it reminded her of him. That small thing was enough to make him feel noticed. That night, Chris finally called his father. He tried to sound calm while asking for $10,000, saying he wanted to start a small business. His father immediately refused. Chris tried lowering the request to $1,000, but it was still rejected. His father even asked if Chris was in trouble and told him to come home. That answer made Chris feel like he was begging, not asking for help. With his emotions already building up, he refused and hung up. At that point, Chris made a big decision. He chose to join the robbery plan. To him, it felt like the only path left, the only way to move forward without going back to his family and admitting failure. Chris started helping the group. He gave them the information they needed, even taking photos of the vault to help with the planning. Gary gave him a specific task, which was to make sure his friend Ted wouldn't show up during the robbery, since Ted's schedule was unpredictable. Meanwhile, Louvely started staying over at Chris's place more often. One night, while Chris was asleep, Louvely woke up and went to the kitchen to find something to eat. There, she ran into Louis, who was already awake. Louis used the moment to talk to her. He questioned Louvely's intentions because he didn't believe the relationship was truly genuine. Louis then shared his past, how he had fallen into a bad environment and unknowingly poisoned himself while making meth, which eventually caused him to lose his sight. Louis said he didn't want Chris to fall into the same mistake. But Louvely got offended instead. She became defensive and insisted that she truly loved Chris. Their conversation grew more heated. Chris, who heard everything, stayed silent. He was no longer sure who to believe or what was really happening around him. A few days later at the bank, Ted came as usual, bringing donuts for Chris. But this time, the situation was different. Chris tried to keep his distance. He even pretended to be offended, as if Ted's kindness was just pity. In reality, Chris just didn't want Ted to be around on the night of the robbery. The next day, things got worse. While eating at a restaurant, Chris suddenly started an argument with Louis for no clear reason. He criticized the way Louis talked to the waiters, saying it was embarrassing. He even said he wanted to move out and live on his own. Those words clearly hurt Louis. Chris, not expecting that reaction, immediately asked for the check, and his sudden change in attitude made the waiter feel awkward too. On the other side of town, Louvely sat in the back seat of a taxi, staring out the window. She asked the driver to stop, just to see Chris one more time before she left. There was a feeling that was hard to explain, as if she herself wasn't fully sure about what she was doing. Before all that happened, Tuttle had come to see Chris at the bank. He returned Chris's medical ID card, and for the first time, he acknowledged Chris's hard work. He even offered him a new position as an employee after the holidays. It should have been good news, but Chris just looked confused about how to feel. Not knowing who to share it with, Chris called Lewis. Lewis thought Chris was causing trouble at home again, but Chris explained that he was still at the bank. Unfortunately, before Chris could explain further, Uncle Bone showed up with the rest of the group. Chris tried to say he wasn't going through with the robbery. He promised he wouldn't tell anyone, but Gary immediately punched him in the stomach, making it clear there was no turning back now. The robbery began. They cut the camera wires and started breaking into the vault. The situation was already tense, but it got even more complicated when Ted suddenly showed up at the bank unexpectedly. Gary pointed a gun at Chris from behind, forcing him to act normal in front of Ted. Chris tried to hold it together. Ted came just to talk for a bit, even saying it might be his last shift there because he wanted to focus on welcoming his child. Chris felt happy hearing that. He also took the chance to apologize for his earlier behavior. Ted didn't make a big deal out of it, since he understood Chris's condition wasn't something he could fully control. After Ted left, they finally managed to open the vault. Chris was forced to take the money and help move it into the car. For a moment, everything seemed to be going smoothly. But things changed again when Ted came back, this time bringing donuts. No one expected him to show up twice in the same night. When no one greeted him, Ted started to get suspicious. From the reflection in the glass, Ted saw Gary. Gunshots immediately broke out. In an instant, 2 members of the group were killed, and Gary was wounded. The situation turned chaotic. When Ted approached Gary, Chris tried to warn him about Bone, but Ted was too focused and didn't realize the danger behind him. Bone shot him without warning. Gary then ordered him to finish Ted, and Bone did it without hesitation. Panicking, Chris ran out through the back door, taking the car with the money. But at that moment, he was haunted by flashbacks of the past accident. His emotions were unstable. On the road, Chris was stopped by the police for driving without headlights. But when the officers saw his medical card, they understood his condition and let him go. They even offered to drive him home, but Chris refused and continued on his own. Chris eventually stopped on a dark road and opened the trunk. Inside was the money, along with a shovel and cement. The situation felt even heavier. When he got back to the apartment, Chris saw the lights on. He immediately knew something was wrong. He called, and sure enough, Gary was inside with Lewis. Gary threatened to kill Lewis if Chris didn't hand over the money. But this time, Chris didn't hesitate. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., he set one thing clearly in his mind. Lewis couldn't get hurt at all. Chris told Gary that he would pick Lewis up first, and once everything was safe, then he would tell him about the money. After that, Chris opened his notebook. In the only way he could, he started putting together a plan. This wasn't just daily notes anymore, but steps to end all of this. He intended to stop Gary and Bone, no matter the risk, to save Lewis. Chris went to his parents' house and took his father's gun. He hid the weapon inside one of the bags of money. Everything felt like walking on a thin line. One wrong move could destroy everything. In his exhaustion, Chris fell asleep and dreamed about Kelly. In the dream, she looked calm. She said she had forgiven him and had moved on with her life. She also told Chris to do the same. The dream felt so real, like the only peaceful moment he had. But reality hit again when Uncle Bone found him. Chris was forced to hand over the money, but he said he didn't remember where he had put it. Gary then checked Chris's notebook, and from that, he realized the money was buried on the same road as the old accident site. They forced Chris to go there and dig it up. When Chris saw the shoelace in the bag that held the rifle, his memory of the plan he had made started to come back. It was the moment he had been waiting for. Bone took one of the bags and told Chris to carry the other. But at that moment, Chris made his move. He came up from behind and shot Bone until he fell. For the first time, Chris truly fought back, and it saved Lewis's life. Gary couldn't put up much of a fight. His earlier gunshot wound had weakened him, and his condition got worse from the blood loss. Chris even stopped Gary from reaching for his inhaler that could have helped him survive. After everything was over, Chris chose a different path. He handed the money over to the authorities and admitted his involvement, explaining everything in detail. At first, the FBI doubted his story. It was hard to believe that someone with Chris's condition could go through all of that. But then it was revealed that Gary had accidentally cut the phone line, not the camera wires. From that, it became clear that Chris had been under pressure and forced into it. With the trust of Mr. Tuttle, Chris got a loan. From there, he finally opened a restaurant with Lewis, bringing to life the plan that had once been underestimated. Slowly, his life started to get better. Chris showed progress in his classes, and those who once doubted him now came as customers, including his own father and Mr. Tuttle. Chris also started doing things he used to enjoy again, like skateboarding. Deep down, he still held on to the hope that one day Kelly would truly forgive him. And when that day came, he wanted to be ready to meet her, not as the same person he used to be, but as someone who had changed. In the end, Chris realized that redemption doesn't mean erasing the past. It's about how he can live with all those mistakes while trying to become a better person.